learning performance distinction is that learning a behavior and performing a behavior are two different things. You can learn a behavior but not perform the behavior. But what's important to take away from this is that not performing the behavior doesn't necessarily mean you didn't learn the behavior. So again, just because these kids initially didn't perform the behavior of acting aggressive towards this Bobo doll, that doesn't mean that they didn't learn it, because it was clear once you bribe these kids with juice and stickers and things that they like, they were in fact able to perform that aggressive behavior. So they actually did learn, even though they didn't act that way. And again, this is what's important when you think of that classic debate of whether they should ban certain types of violent video games, because you'll hear people who are against the censorship saying, well, you know, my child plays violent video games and doesn't act aggressive, or my child watches violent movies and doesn't act the way that those people do on TV. But that doesn't necessarily mean that just because they're not performing that behavior that they're seeing, that doesn't mean they're not learning that behavior. So it's a scary thought to think about, right?
There is a fascinating paradox in education, where students can be wildly successful on tasks in class, but learn virtually nothing. The opposite is also true, as students can do relatively poorly on those same tasks, but learn quite a lot. The reason for this is the fact that performance is short-term, whereas learning is long-term. What this means is that we won't know if someone has actually learned something until after a period of time in which they have not used or thought about the information. Literature indicate that short-term performance is a lousy indicator of long-term learning, but it also shows that learning and performance can be inversely related. In other words, when one is up, the other can be down. Punishment is a term used in operant conditioning psychology to refer to any change that occurs after a behavior that reduces the likelihood that that behavior will occur again in the future. While punishment can be effective in some cases, you can probably think of a few examples of when a punishment does not consistently reduce unwanted behavior. For example, after being sent to jail for a crime, people often continue committing crimes once they are released from prison. As such, any behavior changes that result from punishment are often temporary. Psychologist B.F. Skinner said that punished behavior is likely to reappear after the punitive consequences are withdrawn. Does bribing change behavior? Well, yes and no. For example, a child may not want to transition to the cafeteria during school and starts a tantrum. While the child is screaming, the teacher says, "If you quit screaming, I will give you a candy." The child calms down and gets the candy. As soon as the class starts to transition to lunch, the child starts a tantrum again in the hallway. As we can see, bribing somewhat worked to get a reaction, but not to change behavior. As such, rather than paying for desired behaviors, positive reinforcement is given to the child contingent upon appropriate behavior. For example, the parent or teacher will give the child the reinforcer when they engage in the appropriate or desirable behavior. The difference between bribery and reinforcement is that with bribery the reinforcer comes before the child has engaged in appropriate behavior, and with positive reinforcement, the reinforcer comes after the child has engaged in the appropriate behavior. This rule is called the Premack principle or Grandma's rule. For example, we can say, first you finish your dinner, then you get dessert. It is very important that parents and teachers do not back down, even if the child starts to engage in problem behavior to obtain the item. Imagine an individual who has never played basketball before, watches a basketball game on television, and learns the main concept of the game, which is getting the ball into the basket. This behavior is now learned but remains latent until the person actually plays basketball for the first time and shoots the ball into the basket. The learning performance distinction shows the difference between learning, as in watching the basketball game, and grasping the concept of the behavior, and performance, which is actually performing the behavior.